Good morning, everybody. I think we have a few people still joining us, and I got the agenda here, I think, on the screen. I believe everybody can see that. We'll get started here in just a few minutes. Maybe we'll have a few more people join us, so please stand by. All right. Good morning, everybody. I hope everybody can hear me as we prepare to get started. First off, I want to thank you for this kind of out of cycle state technical committee meeting. Appreciate everybody making the effort today to join us for this important meeting to talk really specifically about some of the climate smart activities we are doing here in NRCS and NRCS Ohio, and provide an opportunity for you to help us out for the future. So without taking a lot of time, like I said, we've kind of got a packed agenda this morning. I will turn it over to John if you're ready, John.
Okay, good morning, everyone. And again, I want to reemphasize what Eric just stated as far as we thank you guys for joining us this morning. And certainly it was short notice, but we wanted to really talk about the Climate-Smart Agriculture and Forestry. I know we mentioned it at our last tech committee, but we wanted to really spend more time on the Climate-Smart Agriculture and Forestry, because it is a top priority of the agency and throughout this country. We're doing some things, through the Inflation Reduction Act. In fiscal year 2023, we received additional funding, and we are in the process of implementing those funds right now. But it was really like a 2023 is more of a dress rehearsal for fiscal year 24 and beyond, because the money will escalate quite quickly and significantly here in the next few years. So we need your input, your recommendations on how best to utilize those funds and address the resource concerns that affect climate change. So we will be asking for you guys to provide some recommendations to us on those instances where we can make some changes in what we're doing now. Like Eric said, we've been working on this for quite a while. As a matter of fact, he and I were discussing yesterday about having a climate smart subcommittee of the state committee. The funny thing about that is all of the subcommittees really, when we talk about the different programs and different landscapes, are working to address climate smart agriculture. But we do want to place some emphasis on that. And so we have that on the table. There's a possibility of having a climate smart subcommittee that just really focuses on that. So as we go through the discussion, we will have that as a consideration. But we wanted to give a big overview of the climate smart agriculture. If you look on the agenda, we do have time for that from the national perspective, but then we'll talk about it from the local perspective here in Ohio. That's all I have to say right now. So, Eric, do we just want to go down the agenda, or do you?
Yeah, I
turn
think
it back over
that'll
to you.
be fine. We invited Dr. Patterson to speak a little bit from the FSA perspective. Again, we appreciate his ability to get on here short notice. Dr. Patterson.
Good morning, all. And what an appropriate time. I was just a few minutes ago reading news updates, and I found this on NPR, their top lead is about Arizona farmers are running out of water, forcing farmers to confront climate change. And some real issues out there, but we have different challenges here. Again, with the land acquisition that Intel and the Honda battery plants are making close to Columbus, and the stress that that's going to put on the underground aquifer, especially out in Licking County, the jobs that will be created as a result of that, the housing that will be needed, the infrastructure that will have to be expanded, the solar farms that are going up. There is a lot of different moving parts that are going to put increased stress on our agriculture. And we at FSA stand ready, shoulder to shoulder with our dear brothers and sisters in NRCS to take on Climate Smart Ag here in Ohio. Just a couple of other things to bring you up to date. Urban Ag, we have hired, since we met last, a county executive director on board. He started a couple of weeks ago, making contacts, and the Urban Ag effort is another one of these components to help offset some of the challenges that our farm folks are facing in terms of supply. But that effort is moving in Cleveland, will be replicated elsewhere. The other thing that's chewing up a lot of our time recently, and this includes my dear friend John and Jonathan McCracken, is the East Palestine situation with respect to the long-term impact. Obviously, as you're aware, I hope, OSU's plant tissue sampling results came back earlier, and resulting in no red flags, no alarms. Pennsylvania State University is conducting similar tests, and they're just running a week or so behind us. I'm thinking that they're going to find the same end result. So we've tested air, tested soil, tested plant tissues. The last big X factor is water, and quite frankly, the underground process with those semi-volatile organic compounds potentially leaching into not only the Sentinel wells, but other wells in the area. So the three of us on the fifth floor are very much concerned in the long term, should that happen, and what the long-term impact would be with East Palestine and our brothers and sisters across the state line with respect to property values, ag values, businesses, human health, water and water availability, all those things on the table. But it's just been an unexpected wrinkle since we saw you last. But we're on top of that situation as much as we can be as well. So here we go, confronting the challenges of agriculture. We've done it in the past. We'll do it now and prepare a greater future for our children. Looking forward with great expectations, all that we do to help the American farmer and ultimately the American consumer. Eric, I'll kick it back to you, buddy.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It's always challenge to think about, our producers in the state, and there's a lot going on. Probably like it has been in the past and will be in the future, but it is a good time to be in the conservation business. We have a lot of opportunities, I think. So if we look at our agenda, I think we're going to get right into it. We were lucky enough to get Adam Reed. Adam, I don't know if you're on and available, and Adam serves in many different roles within NRCS, but he is in one of his many titles, I guess. He's the co-lead of the Midwest Climate Hub, which is an important resource that we can rely on here at the state. And I kind of asked him to just give us a overview of NRCS's perspective of climate smart, kind of at that national level. And then when he gets done, I'll try to tie it down a little bit to Ohio specific and get into a little more detail. So with that, Adam, thank you for coming today, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
All right, thanks, Erica. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yep, we sure can hear you, and we see your slide. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, it's very good to be with you guys today for this important meeting. Climate is certainly a big topic for the agency right now. And just a little bit about what I'll be talking about is a little bit about myself and what I'm doing here. I'm a regional agronomist in the Fort Worth National Technical Support Center, and I serve to support the state agronomist in the central region, everywhere from Texas up to North Dakota, over to Michigan, and down towards Louisiana. Unfortunately, Ohio is not one of my states in my agronomy world, but the Midwest Climate Hub does cover Ohio. Some of the things I'll be talking today is we're going to talk about adaptation and mitigation, those concepts, NRCS's role, a little bit about some greenhouse gases and where NRCS can intersect with those, examples of mitigating conservation practice standards, and the concept of co-benefits and some resources. So if you're not familiar with the Midwest Climate Hub, the team is small, but it's growing. They have funding to be hiring some fellows and some postdocs to do some additional work, but it's led by the director, Dennis Toddy, who is a climatologist himself, and Lori Nowaki, the coordinator, and Melissa Cutoff, the professional staff. And so my role as an NRCS co-lead is just to participate in their meetings, help bring NRCS better to the table, and facilitate communications from the hub out to the states, and vice versa from the states to the hub, just to make sure they know the needs and maybe what they can provide to help meet those needs. And they work with a big network of partners. You can see just a few of them here, but Ohio State is definitely on the list, and they have a lot of stakeholders, a lot of interested parties. And since the Midwest Climate Hub is right in the heart of the Corn Belt, much of their work is very agricultural themed. And they put out some good publications on a monthly and quarterly basis to really look at what are the current conditions, looking at soil moisture and temperatures, and looking at what is the next 30 days or maybe 14 days look like to help producers make good management decisions. So that's enough about the hub. Now we'll get into the real meat of the presentation. And so just to help understand the situation, so over the last many decades, a lot of greenhouse gases have been emitted into the atmosphere, and that is having impacts on the climate. And just so you know, agriculture plays an important role in that. About 11% of the greenhouse gases emitted nationally are from agriculture. And producers are experiencing the impacts of climate change, but it really depends where you're at in terms of what the impacts you might be experiencing. There are some places in the US, maybe around the Gulf Coast, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, the climate change really has not been significant. The rainfall hasn't changed, the temperatures haven't changed so much, but there's other places that they're observing significant climate change, just like the example we heard just a moment ago about in Arizona. Another example, I was in Vermont last week, right on Lake Champlain, and I was talking to some locals, and they were sharing with me that 50 years ago, the lake would freeze over every winter, and ice fishing was very popular. But today, in recent years, the lake has been freezing over like 20%, 25% of the time, and the ice is not thick. And actually, they had several fatalities this year with people believing that it was safe to be on the ice, and yet they fell through. So, and then in the Midwest, it seems like the biggest experience we're seeing is shifting in rainfall patterns and precipitation patterns, and warmer winters. And I've been hearing reports from areas that are growing a lot of fruit trees that they're not getting the cooling days, and it's impacting the flowering of the fruit trees in the spring. So solutions, well, it's not rocket science, but there's no silver bullet either. But for our producers, we're going to be talking to them about how can they change their management to better adapt to these changing conditions, and that's called adaptation. And then producers also can play an important role in being part of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and maybe even taking greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. And that is getting to the root cause, and that is mitigation. So NRCS's role, we want to support those customers and producers both in adapting to a changing climate and to help them mitigate as well. And we want to also better understand the science informed good understanding and responses to climate change. So just to review this one last time, mitigation, adaptation. So mitigation, the measures to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases being emitted that will reduce the speed of future climate change and hopefully even remove them from the atmosphere. And adaptation is the actions taken by individuals or locally, regionally, or at national levels to reduce the risk from today's changing conditions and prepare for additional changes in the future. And adaptation is that's what we've been doing at NRCS for the beginning, adapting to the changes in the environment. And that leads us into resilience. We want to help producers have a resilient operation that can help them with cover and withstand shocks and stressors. And I think about it, a shock, I'm thinking about, a really intense 2-inch rain in an hour. That's a shock. And stressors can be, after that rain, maybe it won't rain again for, 45 days. You have a long dry period. So it makes me think about the soil health that we've been promoting at the agency, trying to, help that soil become more resilient and more structure in it so that when it does rain hard, it's resistant to erosion and takes more of that water into the soil profile and holds it so that when we have drier periods that it can supply moisture through those dry periods to the growing crops and plants. And so if you don't remember anything else I say today, this next sentence is the one that helped me clarify in my mind mitigation and adaptation. And it says, while mitigation addresses the causes of climate change, adaptation and resilience addresses the consequences of climate change. And that leads us right into climate-smart agriculture and forestry. And it's just an integrated approach to help producers and farmers and ranchers respond to climate change by reducing their greenhouse gas emissions and adopting those practices that make them more resilient for a changing environment. And and also not forgetting about producers need to be productive and keep their agricultural incomes up as well. So our role is, we've talked a lot about adaptation and mitigation, but we also want to understand the science and better improve our understanding of climate change, the impacts, and our response to that, and translating this science into information and action. And the action that we will be taking is, through our conservation planning process. We are going to help producers write conservation plans and apply those conservation standards that help them be, adapt to changing climate and help them mitigate for those greenhouse gases as well. And there are 3 main greenhouse gases, and we have an opportunity to work with all 3 of them. So I know everybody's heard about CO2 emissions, and that's we're familiar with that because we understand photosynthesis. Plants take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, put it into leaf matter, stems, and stalks and roots into a biologic form of carbon. But as those plants are, harvested and that residue is put back into the soil, it's decomposed by the soil microbiology and the worms and everything, and that respiration puts the CO2 back into the atmosphere. But we have conservation practices that can slow down that practice or slow down that activity. We also have methane as another greenhouse gas. It can be some of the main sources of that is from the enteric fermentation of ruminants and from manure storage, manure handling facilities. Probably not a big concern in Ohio, but under rice cultivation, methane can be a big source. And lastly, nitrous oxide. This is one I'm particularly interested in. And I'll tell you why. So when we apply nitrogen fertilizer to the soil, It's either in a nitrate form or in another form that will be converted into nitrate. And when soils become wet, that nitrate can be denitrified as N2 gas to the atmosphere. Now, N2 gas isn't a problem because N2 gas is not a greenhouse gas. Our atmosphere is nearly 80% N2 gas. But through the denitrification process, not all of the nitrate gets converted to N2. A portion of it doesn't make it all the way, and it's lost as N2O, and that's nitrous oxide. Now, nitrous oxide, one molecule of that is the equivalent of 300 CO2s, or carbon dioxide. So another way of saying it, it is 300 times more powerful as a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide. And what makes it even more of a challenge, it's very stable. Once it's in the atmosphere, it can persist for 100 or more years. So how are we going to address some of these? So it's just a few of the examples I have here is we have cover crops. It's a great practice to take in CO2 and put some of that carbon back into the soil. Here in the upper left-hand corner, we have a manure spreader. So if we can apply fertilizers and manures to the land at the right rate, timing, placement, and form, we'll reduce the amount of nitrous oxides lost. We have technologies and engineering practices like anaerobic digesters, which can capture that methane gas from animal waste storage areas and use it to help power the dairy or whatever the operation is. And then we also have practices like reduced tillage and no tillage, which can slow down the breakdown of soil organic matter and actually build soil organic matter, which is basically sequestering CO2 from the atmosphere into the soil. And then just want to share a little bit about co-benefits. A lot of our practices have multiple benefits. For instance, cover cropping. And so I'm an agronomist, so I think a lot about agronomy practices. So I'm sorry, but most of my examples are agronomy related. But cover cropping, it can provide mitigation because it takes CO2 from the atmosphere and puts it in the soil. It can provide adaptation because we can choose different cover crops that work in a changing precipitation and temperature regimes. And cover crops, when used correctly, they can provide a lot of resilience to an operation because it can help build those soils up and buffer against those extreme weather events. But the effectiveness of cover crop and any of our conservation really has to do with how they are installed. So for example, if a cover crop is established, grown up, and then plowed under and disced up 3 or 4 times to prepare a seed bed for the cash crop, that cover crop's the carbon it put in the soil is most of it's gonna get lost pretty quickly. But if cover crop can be utilized in conjunction with other conservation practices like reduced tillage or no-till or maybe conservation crop rotation, it can really enhance its effectiveness. So I got 3 examples here of some other situations that you might find. We have an illustration here of a producer who has a very poor pasture. So the producer's interest very well may be inadequate feed and forage for his livestock or something else along those lines. And we have practices that can address that. We can help that producer understand, how cross fencing and rotational grazing can really improve the pastures by allowing some areas to be grazed while others are resting. And so we can meet that producer's need of improving their pasture situation. But at the same time doing so, we're growing more biomass, we're putting more carbon into the soil. So it's also addressing climate at the same time. So it's a co-benefit. Likewise, we could have a situation where a producer is seeing extreme erosion events. Maybe that's climate related. Maybe that's why they're seeing that. Maybe it's wind. This one is wind, but it very well could be a water erosion issue as well. But we have practices that can deal with that. We can help them go to reduced tillage, no tillage, change their conservation crop rotation, possibly apply some cover crops through those critical times as well. So we can meet that need of soil erosion, but at the same time, we're going to have a great impact on the climate as well by putting more of that CO2 from the atmosphere into the soil. And lastly, I have one more example here. Maybe we have a stream bank stabilization problem, and maybe the stream bank is getting worse more rapidly because of the climate change due to flashier rains, more intense rains, and this producers their immediate concern is probably going to be they're losing 3 or 4 rows of soybeans every year just due to the stream bank cutting into their field. And we have practices that can fix that. We have riparian practices and buffer practices that can help with that, and some engineering practices. But at the same time, we're having a positive impact on the climate as well. So we can address climate and other resource concerns all at the same time. And so we've talked a lot about mitigation and adaptation, and you're probably going to be hearing more about mitigation due to the IRA funding, which is coming. But we do have a practice list here, and I believe Eric maybe or somebody else may talk about it in more detail. But that it identifies, I don't recall exactly, it seems like there's 39 conservation practices, another 40 plus CSP enhancements that can address climate change. And these are all mitigation practices that are actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions or sequestering CO2 into the soil. So I'm about done here, Eric. Just a couple resources I was going to point out. This is a really good website. It's actually a SharePoint site. It's only for internal to NRCS, but it's a great way to get information out to our field office planners and anybody working in the world of climate, which is all of us at this point in time in one degree or another. But this is another resource that's available to everybody, and it allows you to click on your state and get a one-page report about the current conditions of the climate in your state and kind of what does 40 years from now look like. It has it down by the season in terms of spring, summer, fall, and winter, typical temperatures now, typical rainfall now, and what would it look like 40 or 50 years from now. I can't remember what the time frame is. And some areas it's getting wetter, some areas it's getting drier. In a big picture, it seems like the drier states are trending drier and the wetter states are trending a little more moist. But you can also drill down to individual counties and see what's going on in individual counties. And the last thing at the bottom of this report on the left-hand side, it's too small to see, I know, but it talks about the top causes of crop loss in the county. And those are typically due to too much rain or not enough rain, drought conditions. But there are also different factors. There's also hail, I believe, on the list. Hail is usually not nearly as high, just because a hailstorm usually doesn't impact the entire county, whereas a drought can be, more than countywide, it can be multi-statewide. So this is just a good resource. It's a good conversation starter if we're visiting with someone and they have some interest in climate. So Eric, I believe that's all I've got for you today. And I'm going to turn it back over
thank you, Adam.
to you.
That was,
you bet.
That was very helpful as we kind of transition. I think we've got a little bit of time. If anybody has a question, there's going to be time for questions at the end as I get myself set up. If there's any questions, I really appreciate, and we'll share those links in the presentations, but those one-page fact sheets are something worth taking a look at. I found myself trying to look county to county to see what the differences were, and even some of our surrounding states. It is very interesting to me, some of that information that was put together. Now I just got to figure out what I'm doing here. I need to share my screen first. Sorry. All righty. I got too many buttons on my computer. So maybe Tim or somebody can tell me if we're seeing our screen.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Again, Adam, thank you very much. And it's really helpful to think about and to define some of those terms. I think sometimes people in the conservation business and myself included, we hear terms about like climate smart agriculture, and we make some assumptions, and we make like everyone, you have your ideas of what that means. But I think it is really important as we move forward in thinking about climate smart agriculture to really think, almost separately, or to make sure we understand the distinction between that adaptation and mitigation. Adaptation, as some of I like history and like to think about our history and our past, and especially our history as conservation partners. Adaptation and dealing with challenges that land managers face really is in our blood. That's who we are. We're NRCS is a direct result of the Dust Bowl and the challenges that were faced then and were overcome. I see this as an opportunity for us to step up, not only to make our systems adapt for this change, but be part of the solution in terms of the mitigation. So I appreciate that, Adam. It's exciting. I'm going to talk today a little bit about what does that mean for Ohio? What does that mean for our planners out there in the field? What does that mean for our producers? And think about how we're going to be able to leverage some of this IRA funding to get those conservation practices on the ground that not only are going to help with these bigger overarching issues, but will help that individual producer have a more sustainable operation, have a successful operation for now and the future. So it's exciting to me. So if we can see if all my buttons work here. Come on, wake up. There we go. So when I think about climate smart agriculture in Ohio, and what does that mean for those individual producers, we all recognize and know, living in Ohio, the challenges that our producers face, those increased temperatures. When you look at the data, a lot seems to be those not necessarily significant increases in high temperatures, but those nighttime lows in the summer and those winter temperatures that are changing, again, how things affect how land management needs to take place. It affects diseases, affects all kinds of stuff. We have all seen, I've seen, we probably all have examples already this year, maybe where we've had these storm events already. Again, those storm events, we've seen other presentations, where these significant 1.5 to 2 inch storm events are much more frequent, in really facing challenges. As a former agronomist myself, the one that always gets to me, and we've all seen Aaron Wilson from Ohio State present that information about those suitable working field days. How does that change how we manage our land, where we have less time in the spring, less time in harvest time to get what we need to get done? And how is that changing our producers and equipment? And that too has ramifications. We're pushing out, maybe getting on marginal land because we know there's only so many days we can get things planted, and everything is interrelated. None of this, everything has co-benefits, and in some ways everything has co-negative effects. So we face, I think, real challenges to help producers, help the land, our mission. So what I'm going to do, again, thinking about that mitigation and adaptation, kind of to continue that, we're going to go through some practice, this practice list. I should have I'll put the link in the chat. I should have done that before I started presenting screen. Maybe one of my cohorts can help put that link in the chat. But with the IRA funding and our task to really focus on mitigation, we have the opportunity to install practices to create conservation plans that have those co-benefits. But again, with the funding mechanism, we're going to leverage these activities that are mitigating activities. The national office has created this list, like Adam talked about. There are 137 activities, 39 practices, 95 CSP enhancements, and 3 CSP bundles. What does that mean? All of those things, I like to think about practices and enhancements and bundles is our toolbox for our planners. When we're creating that conservation plan, what options do we have? Again, this list was put together by the national office, and we're going to talk about it. It is the FY23 list. I'm going to kind of try to lay out what that looks like for Ohio this year. This list will be updated annually, and towards the end, we'll be sharing with you how you guys can help us at NRCS, help Ohio, and help our producers in really taking a look at this list and seeing if things can be added. So what I'm going to do is kind of go through by land use and looking at that list of those 137 activities. What does that look like for Ohio? Obviously, that's a national list. There's things on there that aren't really reasonable tools or aren't tools for us here in Ohio. So just to give you a perspective of what most of our plans will look like, leveraging those mitigating activities and leveraging those extra dollars. So on cropland, and this is a great example, and Adam covered this a little bit, of those co-benefits: conservation crop rotation, the residue management, the cover crops, the nutrient management, planting perennials for hay production, and mulching are all activities that we use a lot within our conservation plan for those soil health benefits, for those water quality benefits that are so important to Ohio. Those practices are on the list. They obviously have mitigating components to them, and we can leverage those practices with this new task that we have. When we think about pasture, the real focus is again prescribed grazing. We know that purposefully managing our grazing of animals and purposely having those livestock harvested in such a way will build that soil organic matter, will make that soil function better. And also, again, thinking about those plantings of perennials and maybe even converting cropland to those perennials for grazing systems are all important mitigating factors. The one thing I want to explain when we think about creating conservation plans and leveraging these dollars, this idea of supporting practices that become really important. So when we enter our conservation plans within our planning tools, we have this idea of we can have primary practices that address resource concerns, and then we can have other practices that support it. So when we look at this list, if we think about ideas for this list for the future, I want us all to kind of realize we're not going to install half of a system. If we need other practices to make the practice that's addressing that resource concern work, they can be considered supporting practices, and they can be included in some of these funding opportunities. Pasture is a good example, and it's the example we explain our planners how this concept. Obviously, we address a lot of resource concerns in the pasture land use. with prescribed grazing, but oftentimes it takes a whole slew of practices to make that work, whether that's fencing, spring development, some kind of source of water, oftentimes the pipeline for those watering facilities, the heavy use areas around those water facilities. So when we look at this list and think about how we leverage that list of mitigating activities, just in the back of your mind, kind of keep in mind that those supporting practices will be included in the plan. We don't have to, obviously a lot of these supporting practices, or sometimes they don't have mitigating type properties, but they will be included in those plans. And the other thing I was going to point out in these few slides here, the blue text with the star, those are on that fiscal year 23 list. The ones in the red text, those supporting practices aren't, but again, will be included in those conservation plans and be able to be leverage some of those dollars. So that's the pasture land use. When we think about the forested land use, obviously, tree and shrub establishment is a practice that we could leverage some of the wildlife management type activities, forest stand improvement, and some of the wildlife plantings. Again, are all current kind of on that Climate-Smart list for fiscal year 23. As you can see, it's a little more limited to those practices than maybe some of the other land uses, and doesn't have maybe the full suite of things that we often are doing in that forested land use. And then, I'm sorry, go ahead, Tim.
You have a couple questions.
Yeah.
The first one being from Julie Barton. What does that mean about the list?
What does that mean about the list? So
Sorry,
this
Eric,
list,
like
yeah.
regarding the fiscal year, that wasn't a very articulate question, but it makes
No,
sense
it's okay.
if we were having a conversation. What does that mean in terms of that not being included on the fiscal year 23 list, but the supporting practices still being included in the plan? Can you break that down?
Yeah, the list is how we're going to leverage these additional funds, and it's on the 23 list. So this is how we are leveraging these funds for this year. Here, the slide or two, I'm building up to, if you guys have ideas and say, holy cow, Eric, this isn't including this practice, this type of activity, how can we influence that list? We're going to talk about how you guys can help us influence that list for the future. The supporting practices, the only reason why I'm including it is just to let you know that list doesn't have to be comprehensive. We are going to install a full system. We're going to install the practices that are needed to make the system. The prescribed grazing is a good example, to make that prescribed grazing function. So all the practices don't need to be on the list, just the practices, and there's criteria that we'll go over. So just the practices that meet that criteria. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So again, on the, is there another question, Tim?
Yeah. Do you just want me to interrupt while they're fresh in your
I
mind?
think we're
Okay.
doing okay on time, maybe.
Mark
Getting
Wilson
close.
asks, can a no-till planter or drill be considered a supporting practice for no-till?
Okay, that's a question that sometimes we get. The way we do conservation planning is we plan activities, either structural practices, thinking of grass waterways, drop structures, waste storage structures, or management practices. We don't necessarily offset the cost of new equipment, such as a no-till drill, but we can provide, through some of our programs, incentive payments to implement no-till, and then obviously there's cost associated with that, and maybe a producer could buy that. So nothing has really changed in terms of how we do business with this new opportunity. We're still gonna, it's still gonna have the look and feel of we create a conservation plan. We see where the funds we can leverage, whether that's EQIP, CSP, our easement activities, our RCPPs type activities, and we'll get a little bit more into that a little bit later. So,
Carrie did comment, NRCS cannot purchase equipment. We pay for a resource to be addressed.
right. Yep. Through our conservation practices.
And then one last question from Keegan Colt.
Okay.
If a mitigating activity is already or has been under contract on a parcel, can a new supporting practice be added leveraging IRA funding?
No, I don't think that would be a case. We would have to go back to that operation, look at what has currently been implemented, think about new practices. So I think the answer to that would be no.
That was it.
Okay. So if we move on and think about what kind of activities that we could leverage on this climate smart mitigation list that's currently on the list that we would do on Farmstead, we're talking about some of our energy practices, the lighting systems and the envelopes and anaerobic digesters. And finally, if we think about kind of those edge of field practices, conservation cover, filter strips, field borders, grass waterways, a lot of those conversions, the forest buffers, the herbaceous cover, the riparian forest buffers and herbaceous covers, and the wetland restoration practices are all currently on the list. Obviously, some of those would have some supporting practices that we would need to get those installed. But that's kind of the state of the list. If we think about those 137 activities between the CSP enhancements that are associated with the practices I talked about and the practices themselves, that's kind of the state. So one of the things that we wanted to bring to your attention is, like we talked about, this list is going to get updated annually. There's two criteria that is being used. The first criteria is, this mitigation benefit. New practices, or the way that the practices are going to be and activities are going to be evaluated, are based on, does the implementation of that activity result in the impact on that carbon and nitrogen cycle that will result in greenhouse gas emissions reductions. Sometimes this first year, I think a real national approach was needed. I think there's probably opportunities for a regional approach, and we can provide that feedback. There also has to be this benefit estimation, for these activities under consideration. There has to be kind of that scientific methodology to quantify the estimated reductions or those benefits to that. So that's the two criteria if we're thinking about making suggestions for updating that list. So let's talk about that process. Again, if you guys if you can help us with this would be great. And we'll provide you some more information in a follow-up email. But these activities or new proposed activities, again, have to meet that criteria. And we also need, scientific literature that kind of documents and supports that so we can include it in that submission. It's going to be an internal submissions. I will handle them. If you want to say, hey, we should consider the way we use this practice in Ohio, should be included on this mitigation list for the future. You'd send that to me. You'd kind of help me with the justification for meeting both criteria. And if we have literature, that's, scientific published data that supports that. That is what we're being asked to provide for their consideration for the future. And again, you would just email that to me. We'll follow up with an email after this meeting. Unfortunately, we've got a short turnaround another reason why we didn't have a lot of time to prepare you for this meeting, and it was out of cycle. But we need this by June 15th so we can meet those requirements for them to consider it for fiscal year 24. So,
Yep.
yeah.
2 questions for you.
Yep, sure.
Kim, more questions. Kim Landsbergen, are the tools available to model the mitigation benefits and qualifications, and are funds still available in Ohio for the FY23?
We're going to get to some of the update on what the current status with FY23 from our program staff. Next in the agenda, the modeling tools. I think NRCS, and I'm not as familiar, maybe Adam wants to weigh in. We're using several, I think, tools maybe to come up with some of these national estimations. I'm not as familiar with nationally how we are reporting our mitigation effects, but I know that that part is being done. If we got time, maybe for one more question, because we're getting a little short on time here.
Yep, just one last. Mark Wilson, can criteria to be met with a qualitative assessment, i.e. NRCS's stewardship tool for an environmental performance step?
The step kind of approach, I think we can ask. This is an evaluation process that it's going to our technical leads at a national level. But I do know that I think the tendency is that we're really trying to do this quantitatively, is my impression. Adam, I don't know if you're still on there or have a feel for what all they're looking for in terms of some of that criteria.
Yeah, Eric, I really think for NRCS, I don't think conservation planners are going to be asked to quantify by running a Comet tool or anything like that. It's going to be built into our conservation assessment tool. So.
Yeah, I think there's just an expectation that we are very purposeful and careful with these funds and can be able to quantitatively say our mitigation efforts were met. So with that, I think next on the agenda is Barb. I assume you can share your screen. Thanks, Barb. We can see your screen, and I think you're still on mute.
There, yeah, I was pressing all the buttons. I missed one. Okay, very good.
Yeah.
So many buttons to pick from. So good morning, everyone. Barbara Baker, the Assistant State Conservationist for Natural Resources. I work on the easement programs and do some Great Lakes restoration initiatives. So thanks for joining us today. Let's see how this is going to work. I'm going to talk about climate-smart agriculture and see if I can go from one screen to another. Let's see. Here it goes. So the first one I'm going to talk about briefly is the agricultural land easements, also known prior to the 14 Farm Bill as the Farm Land Preservation Program, so FRPP, or agricultural land easements now. And all of those programs are, in fact, working lands programs. So any of the practices that Eric just spoke about are available to folks that are enrolled in the agricultural land easements. And the land trusts, when they're putting together their conservation deed, they can add extra items in there concerning climate smart agricultural practices that they would like to see on the landscape. So if there's someone that is particularly interested in, buffers around streams or something, they can add a requirement in that deed to have, buffers around streams or forest land preservation, anything like that they would like to add. They can make it more strict than the NRCS deed. They just can't make it less strict. So anyone that wanted to do that, was interested in the ALE program and wanted to participate, could write a conservation deed that added those kind of practices as a requirement for those properties that are enrolled in that program. Okay. So some things that we're currently doing for agricultural, for Climate-Smart Agriculture include if the folks are enrolled in CRP and that's about to come out, they get extra points in the ranking process because we're trying to encourage those folks to maybe stay in conservation and preserve that land in a more permanent status. If they're planning to use Climate-Smart Agriculture, they get additional points for that if they've got a conservation plan or are currently enrolled in EQIP or CSP where they're going to be implementing some of those Climate-Smart Agriculture practices. They would get additional points in the ranking system. So we're trying to reward those people that are thinking in that way and doing that in this process. If they've got a kind of a diverse landscape out there, so it's not just straight corn and bean rotation going on, but if they've got wetland area, they've got a forest land area, riparian areas, things like that. If they've got a kind of a multitude of different landscape options out there, they'll get additional points for that in the ranking system. And then, buffers along streams, they get additional points if they've got, forest land buffers that are going to help control the temperature of that stream versus just grass buffers. But, either buffer will get them some points, just more for the forest land. So, we're trying to preserve properties that are forward thinking about the climate and the environment that we're trying to preserve. So that's what we're doing for agricultural land easements. And we do have some IRA money, but we don't have any currently available for the agricultural land easement because they're really focusing on properties out west with that money right now that's in the easement program. So we're not participating in that right now. We are participating in the wetland reserve easements. We're just waiting on the funding announcement to see if we have any applications that were accepted because it is a national ranking pool. So for wetlands, I just want to talk briefly about this. So it was estimated that the peat-dominated ecosystems accounted for 30% of the carbon stocks, but it only covers about 5 to 8% of the landscape. So, this is a really big opportunity for us to go ahead and do some wetland restoration to bring back that carbon storage in the soil. And it says the research says that only 55% of the vegetation is restored on a wetland area, it will become a carbon sink. So that's something that we want to look for, if there's places where we can restore wetlands back on those peat soils, return them to the wetlands that they were prior to being drained and farmed, that's something that can really help us be more resilient because we'll have places to absorb more water. If we're getting additional rainfall out there and we can have more storage happening, I think that would really benefit us in the long run. So that's something that we are, looking into. They're not looking into, but we know that that's something that we can do. So in particular in Ohio, prior to human development, we had about 5 million acres of wetlands out there, and now we're down to less than 1 million. And so we've lost a lot of wetlands out there, and that's going to prevent us from being as resilient as we can be because we can't store all of that water and all of those nutrients in the landscape like we could have when we had 5 million acres worth of wetlands. Now I know we're never going to get back to the 5 million acres worth of wetlands, but we can get a little bit closer, and we can really build that resilience back by adding wetlands back into critical ports in the landscape. Some of those like individual pockets of wetlands, maybe that's not where we want to go, but if we can get them along the riverine systems and places like that in the floodplains again, so that when we do get a large rainfall, we can kind of absorb that water and keep it in the landscape longer instead of having less flashiness going forward. So that's something that, we're looking at. We're looking at trying to build corridors along riverine systems. We have a couple for the emergency watershed protection also that we're running right now, the floodplain easements, where we're getting kind of a corridor along a couple of rivers. We're using some GLRI funds for that. So that's something that's really going to hopefully, lead to less flooding downstream because we'll be able to keep that water upstream and keep also the carbon that would be going down. So, we of course offer two different types of easements. We have the permanent easement and the 30-year easement. And so, a wetland restoration really does sequester a lot of carbon in the landscape if we can get a lot of resaturated soil happening. So, and I see, Scott, you're asking if these slides will be available. Yes, Erica's going to work on that, making sure that they're posted to the website, I believe, so we should be good. Upland in addition to, we don't just always take the wetland area. Sometimes we can take up to a 2-to-1 ratio if we've got pockets of hydric soil. So that allows us really to take some upland too. So we can do some either tree planting. Most of Ohio had previously been wooded wetlands. So anytime we can do some tree restoration out there, that trees really do sequester a significant amount of carbon, or also grassland habitat for the upland, depending on where we are in the state, does help us keep some of that carbon sequestered in the vegetation and in the soil if we get permanent cover out there versus, the rotation of corn and beans where the soil is sometimes bare for periods of time. So we do a lot of tree and shrub establishment with our wetland easements. We do a lot of forest stand improvements as well. So we try to control invasive species and those types of things so that we do have the healthiest forest possible on those easements. And also critical area seeding when we're doing restoration, we're doing some earthwork or whatnot. We do critical area seeding with that as well, and to try to get that permanent cover out there, which does sequester the carbon and helps us make that soil healthier and therefore more absorbent of both nutrients and water holding capacity. And I think that prevents the flashiness downstream of those wetland areas to a certain extent. Okay, that is all that I have. I know it's short. We don't do all the practices that Eric listed, so the presentation is a little shorter, but if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. If not, Carrie's got some time to fill, so I know she said she was up for the challenge. So
For the challenge. Thank you so much, Barb. And I don't think we have any questions, but if there's questions, we can try to address them now, or we'll have some time at the end while Carrie gets transitioning.
Are you sharing the slides I sent you, Eric?
Oh, that's right. I said
You did say you were gonna. I can pull mine up. It's
yeah,
not a
pull
problem.
yours up. So I am
Okay.
not on top of my game today.
You're not on top of it. Well, there was a running joke about whether I was going to need to yield my time or whether I was going to need to fill time. So I think we're somewhere in between right now.
Yes, we're good on time. So
Okay. Trying to. Okay. Slides.
we're seeing your slides in presentation mode. It looks good.
Oh my gosh, I got like 3 sets of slides in front of me. This will be great. Okay. So I'm going to just very briefly touch on some of the program side in terms of the financial assistance programs in IRA. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in the details because I think that it is really important to remember that Climate Smart is all about the resources, and it's all about the planning, and it's all about the effects we're having on the land itself. But I do want to just like 3 seconds think about our mission and how what we've talked about today. Barb and Eric and Mr. Reed have talked about today. It's our mission to provide that financial and technical assistance. It's part of our mission to improve the land management, both environmentally and economically, and to help ensure the long-term sustainability of American agriculture. So, it's no surprise that we would be talking about all of these climate smart items and how they impact the environment and where we go. I'm today going to be talking specifically about these 3 programs: the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, RCPP, the Conservation Stewardship Program, CSP, and the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, EQIP. And in fiscal year 23, we started stewing about this. I started stewing about this months ago. As soon as we heard there was this big glut of money coming, it was like, oh my gosh, when is it going to get here? When is it going to get here? What are we going to do? How's it going to impact us? Are we going to have enough time to do all the things that we need to do in our process? So for 23, our methodology was use our existing tools and ranking systems. That is the most efficient way that we know how to operate right now, and people don't have to learn something new to make it happen. We decided to try some new timelines so we could show progress a lot quicker. So on the EQIP side, for IRA, we used a process called Act Now, which meant that we essentially obligated almost $3 million in 8 weeks. The process moves very fast. It's kind of a rolling approval as opposed to some of our other approval processes, which are we get the whole list and then we go down the list with the amount of money we have. With Act Now, we set a threshold score. If you are above the threshold score, you were funded. And I think that process has worked really well. It's our first time to try it. We talked about it last year on something else and we were like, no, we were kind of nervous, but we thought, if we don't give it a try now, we won't know if it's going to work for us in the future or not. So I think it's gone really well this year. We've got a few tweaks to make to the side of the process that we control in terms of how many days things are happening or not happening. But I think it's worked really well for us. And really our 23 methodology was stick to the basics. Nothing fancy this year. We just need to move forward. So all of our fretting and all of our concerns, EQIP, we had a little over $3 million this year. I know it doesn't sound like a lot. I'm going to talk about what that's going to balloon up to in the future. But we were able to obligate the majority of that in about 8 weeks, which is pretty quick for us. And I've been really proud of how the field has responded to the increased timeline and kind of some of those processes that we have been trying out this year. So what happens after this year? So this year we've already had our batching period. We are finishing up our obligations for EQIP. For CSP, we are in the process of going through the eligibility stages of CSP. So that will be coming to where we do pre-approvals and obligations sometime in the next couple months, with everything being obligated before September. So we're kind of working through that process a little bit, but what happens after 23? So RCPP essentially is going to run exactly the same as it's always run. And I have not seen an email today announcing the RFPs, but we have been told it's coming sometime this week, early next week, something along those lines. And what they're going to do is they're going to take all the projects that they get in and they're going to make a determination if it fits under the IRA, the Climate-Smart criteria, then it may get IRA funding or it could get regular Farm Bill funding. So for RCPP, you're either IRA or your Farm Bill, you're one or the other. And it's based on what your project is going to do. So you would then have those funds to complete your project. And that's how they're running RCPP. We don't directly necessarily impact how much of our projects could be IRA or not IRA. We'll just take what they give us and we'll move forward from there. For CSP, things are going to ramp up a little bit in the next couple of years. This year we managed to collect about double our normal application workload between our Farm Bill money and our IRA money. We're hoping to spend all of it this year. That would be a really big accomplishment for us, but it's going to ramp up. So Eric and Mr. Reed both talked about the practice list, the CSP activities that are identified on that Climate-Smart list. And in CSP, all the land uses are allowed, but the practice list we're finding is a little bit limited. CSP, you kind of beef up your payment with the ability to add different land uses, and there's not a lot of options for the farmstead land use. So that's something we've really been talking about here in Ohio, and what can we do to make some suggestions to help that practice list be better for the farmstead land use so that we can get our amount of money up to what the same as it would be with regular CSP funds. So we're really trying to focus on that flexibility and how we can expand that practice list over the next couple of years. One of our biggest barriers in CSP is getting people in the door to listen to what we have to offer. And if you have any thoughts about how to get people in the door to just hear us out on what we can help them with or what we can do in CSP with them, we would be interested in hearing about that. So let us know. In terms of EQIP, after this year, we're going to try to do some focus on some specific land uses. I don't know, the list was pretty small to read, so there aren't a lot of engineering options available on the IRA practice list. It's a lot of management practices, and so and forestry practices and cropland related, and some grazing. So what we anticipate is being able to maybe look at a lot of our engineering might be done with our regular Farm Bill funds, and some of our more specialized things that we can do in IRA is how we're going to spend our IRA funds. But again, we're really trying to increase those available core practices on that list. With IRA, you have to have a core practice in the contract in order to be able to contract any supporting practices. So if we can make those core practices, that there's a few more options to choose from, then it expands our ability to put that money out over the landscape in different land uses. Again, we'll probably look at using some compressed timelines to go from applications to contracts, and that compressed timeline might encompass both Farm Bill funds and IRA funds both. We can do that. That process is a little separate from the money itself. I think our biggest barrier to think about going forward is how do we increase our partner assistance to meet the demand that the funds are generating. We can obligate a lot of contracts, but there's a lot more to contract administration and what the future of those contracts looks like than just obligating a contract. There's a lot of follow-up. There's a lot of work with our producers. Sometimes it requires certain kind of specialized job sheets. It requires site visits. We have to go check them. So we're kind of trying to think about ways that we can increase our partner assistance to help us meet some of those future demands that we're going to see in 2 years and 3 years down the road, because it will be significant based on the amount of money that we have. I think if I could close my part with one thing, it is we are trying to adapt. We're trying to grow. We're trying to learn. We're trying to figure out how we're going to get to do all of this. And I put a little graph up here of kind of what our funds projection looks like. So the green line is IRA CSP. So the brown line, you see a small steady increase. The green line, you see a slight increase and then kind of a bigger pop at the end. And then EQIP, the yellow line is our normal kind of Farm Bill increase of where we go. And you can see that's kind of a steady increase. Usually it goes up $1 million, $1.5 million, just depending on the year. But if you look at the orange line, that's our IRA increase. And we are talking about in addition to all of our Farm Bill funds. So we will have Farm Bill CSP plus Farm Bill IRA on top of it. We will have Farm Bill EQIP and IRA EQIP on top of it. And we're not talking about, this year was $3 million. We're talking about $10 million, $25 million, as much as $40 million potentially on top of what we've already got. So our workload is daunting a little bit for us to think about how are we going to accomplish all of these things. And the only way we're going to accomplish them, is to learn from what we're doing this year, learn from what we've done in the past, and kind of figure out how we can adapt ourselves to maybe a little bit more efficient way of moving forward. So that is all I had, Eric.
All right, Carrie. I think we might have a couple questions, but
Oh, I did not address one. Sorry. Hold on. Let me go
Okay.
back a second. The question was asked about if we have a mitigating activity already under contract or on a parcel, can we add a practice for leverage for IRA funding? The answer is you have to have a core practice in your contract. So we can add to what you're doing if you need to do something new, but it would start with a core practice and then add the supporting practices. I wanted to make sure I went back and said that. I wrote it down, but I didn't look at my notes. So
yeah, I believe you used the word daunting. It for sure maybe is daunting, but look at the opportunity that we have together to make a real impact, not only to these big resource concerns, but to people's lives. We can do a lot of good. We just need to be very purposeful, working together to get that done. So Tim, I'm not sure where you left off in terms. I would just let you keep doing the questions if that's all right.
We're up to date.
Okay. So now we're to the point of opening up. Does anybody have any questions? I feel like we opened up the water, the fire hose on you and gave you a whole bunch of information. We will be sharing the slides in the future, in future emails, and getting them on our website. So any more questions? All right. So to kind of wrap up, John, I don't know if you have any final items. I think one of the things, and we'll follow up with the process of helping us expand that list. I think thinking about all the land uses, making sure we have items that meet that criteria that will work, especially when we think about CSP. I know we will be submitting some things, but please don't assume that we've thought of everything. If you have ideas and if you can help us with that literature, that would be really great. John?
No, I think you kind of covered it very well, Eric, and the folks that gave those presentations. Certainly, we are interested in your input and recommendations, and so we will provide that format for you to send information or emails to Eric, or comments, however you want to, and we will work to see if we can get those incorporated into what we're going to be doing here in the next few years. So again, we do thank you guys joining us in this short notice. I know you guys are all busy, but again, we appreciate you for taking time out to hear what we had to say and let you know that certainly Climate-Smart Agriculture and Forestry is a top priority of the agency. So we, again, thank you for joining us.
And just to kind of put a final touches on this, John, what's next? And we've had a really busy spring, just like I know all of you have. Be expecting some invitations to the subcommittees. Like we talked about before, we're going to have a number of practices to look. I want us to keep in mind, all of our things that we do always have co-benefits. Climate is definitely one that we need to keep in mind, forefront of everything we do. So be expecting that. We're also, I hope we're still on track, John, and maybe we should have talked about this, but I think our hope is to have the next state technical committee meeting will be in person, maybe even involve some field activities. We're still maybe working on some of those details, mid to late summer. So we look forward to getting back together again in person if we can soon.
Exactly. Yeah, that is the plan to hopefully look at some of those maybe Climate-Smart practices through a tour late this summer and kind of go from there. So,
yeah. So, well, I appreciate everybody that was able to speak today. We stayed pretty good on time. That's always when you're doing these virtual meetings, sometimes that is a concern when you're running to get people out on time. We're going to give you a little bit of time back. Be looking for the minute notes and the slides and next steps real soon. So
thank you guys, and
yep.
we'll be in touch.
Yep. You guys have a great rest of the day. Thank you.